All right. Well, it says Hangout on Air is live. So, again, this is Orthodox Apologetics Live, where we answer all your questions and about Orthodox apologetics, defending the Orthodox Church. This is Deacon Joseph Swaden.
This is Hiram Okinick.
And we are live. So right now that we're actually, it's actually kind of quiet. I guess you answered all the questions last week, Father, from Basil and other people, and so.
Yeah, well, we did 2 programs to get through the questions that Basil sent. So.
Oh, okay. Let me see here. One of the newest questions. Hold on. I'm going to just note we're answering this live on the live show because a new person just wrote, "Hello, everyone. What are your thoughts on J.N.D. Kelly's early Christian doctrines on tradition and scripture?"
I've not read the book. I don't really know.
I'm marginally familiar with it. It was by an Anglican divine, and basically, kind of, there are some things that are kind of iffy about it. It's very equivocal when it comes to dealing with orthodoxy and heresy in the first few centuries. So that's one of the things is I always tell, people, if you want to understand the fathers, you should read the fathers. And I tend to think that books on the early church that are written by non-Orthodox authors that are not...
J.N.D. Kelly was John Norman Davison Kelly. He died in 1997. He was a professor at Oxford, and he seemed to have been originally a Presbyterian, he became an Anglican, but he seems to be one of these kind of standard Oxford type, academics.
Yeah.
So.
And, unfortunately, you're still not going to get, really the fullness of the fathers, the understanding of how they thought by going through these people. And plus, on top of that, like he argues for Origen, basically, that he was Orthodox, considered Orthodox 1 year, and then after his death was considered a heretic.
See, that's not true. That's just not true.
He was considered a heretic in his time. But it's that standard equivocation that you see in a lot of these modern writings when it comes to the early church, where they can't distinguish between orthodoxy and heresy or deliberately choose not to. So I think that's, I would say, whenever you're dealing with I don't want to say a secular author because he was, an Anglican of some sort, but he's still technically a secular author in the sense that he's outside the church. I would say read it cum grana salis. It's just it's not something.
Say that again. Read who?
Read it cum grana salis.
Okay.
Solace. Cum grana salis. It's just
the grain of salt.
Yeah, just take it. Read it skeptically. Don't automatically assume that it's necessarily a good thing. Now, this is an interesting thing. It says, we got something that said, "Is there a podcast of this anywhere? I never have enough time to listen. But at work I can, and so what I'm going to do is I found this thing called PodSync. So just for fun, I'm going to just go in here, and if I can create some kind of PodSync thing, then, okay, it says copy, open, and close. Let's see what happens if I put this in a browser, and I'll tell you if we now have a podcast. Okay, I don't know what this is. This looks like it's a bunch of XML, which I guess is what people want. So I will... put this not only in the chat, but I will put, if you want to follow this on your podcasting things, just use PodSyncs here, and that way you can follow that without a problem.
So Basil asked the question, do we... I'm curious what you guys think of Van Til's presuppositional apologetics and his transcendental type arguments.
Who was Van Til?
He was a Calvinist apologist of the early to the mid 20th century, and I put a link in the chat if you wanted to look at it.
Uh-huh.
And basically, it says Van Til earned the label presuppositional because of their central tenet that the Christian must at all times presuppose the supernatural revelation of the Bible is the ultimate arbiter of truth and error in order to know anything. Christians, they say, can assume nothing less because all human thought presupposes the existence of the God of the Bible. They claim that by accepting the assumption of the non-Christians, which fundamentally deny the Trinitarian God of the Bible, one cannot even formulate an intelligible argument. So what? And then he says, then there's an argument of his transcendental argument. This is actually, what do you think, Father? You want to look at it?
I'm reading.
I'm not too familiar. I've heard of Van Til, but I really wasn't that involved in him. I think I may have known him through Rushdoni and a few other people, but not much more.
Yeah, I mean, basically a lot of what he's arguing here, it seems to he's trying to find common ground between, if you hold that if Christians hold a set of presuppositions that are different from non-Christians, then that will color their worldview throughout. And so, let me think here. Basically, I'm just going to read what it says in the wiki here. Van Til arrives at his famous assertion that there is no neutral common ground between Christians and non-Christians because their presuppositions, their ultimate principles of interpretation are different, but because non-Christians act and think inconsistently with regard to their presuppositions, common ground can be found. The task of the Christian apologist is to point out the difference in ultimate principles and then show why the non-Christians reduced to absurdity. I guess. I mean, I don't think it's I don't find anything amazing in that statement. I'm not gonna sit here and go, yeah, well, definitely because he might be right here. Granted, you could make the argument that Tertullian's, I believe, because it's absurd, basically is a central axiom of.
Well, remember, Tertullian refused to argue with a lot of the heretics on their grounds because Tertullian's view was that the scriptures belong to the church.
Right.
So therefore, you're arguing from our book, but he still did make arguments, against them, despite that, because he became a heretic eventually himself. So, unfortunately.
Well, it seems that he was a great opponent of Karl Barth, and my question is, in all honesty, if you're dealing with the fathers of the church, neither of these people should even come up in your studies. I'm not saying that they're going to come up in college theology courses, so on and so forth, but there's still such an emptiness compared to because it really this sort of philosophical dialectic that you find it's kind of like just a far deeper version. It's different in its central principles from scholasticism, but it still maintains that common link of talking without authority, talking without, if you don't have the teaching of the church or the teaching of the fathers, the teaching authority becomes lost. It's all just cheap philosophizing.
I think the problem is people assume the fathers is too complicated, too complex, and their problems are so far removed that this is what people think, or what they're told to think, that if you try to read the fathers, you're really not going to understand anything, so you might as well read something some guy wrote in 2010. And I don't think that's just not true. Why don't people take the Apostolic Fathers and read through them, read through the early Erdmann's editions? You can find them free online and see what happens.
Well, I mean, don't get me wrong. I also don't want to, one thing we don't want to do is oversimplify what, a lot of these late teachers are saying. If anything, they present themselves as more complex than the fathers. And really, it's when you start dealing with minutiae of this sort, it just becomes it's like that thread that was there that was removed. It becomes where you spend so much time on your own presuppositions that have nothing to do with the fathers, but are based on something that you want. That eventually you become convinced that your own arguments are superior to that of the fathers, having never read them. I can think of a few people in this category, and a very small minority of them would even go so far as to consider themselves apologists. But the point is, there's so much fundamentally lost when you're not living and thinking in the spirit of the fathers that it just goes away. I'm not saying that I do. I'm simply saying that people, if you're going to do apologetics for the Orthodox faith, you have to read the fathers. You cannot get away from them. And if you are, and if you're saying, well, let's read this philosopher and this philosopher, you're just wasting your time.
Yes. Aristotle Theophilus asks, good evening. What is the Orthodox Church's view of nationalism, ethno-nationalism, micro-issue in Europe? Sorry if this is a big question. Feel free to move on if you wish not to answer it. Well, one, this was actually answered in two separate programs. If you go back to Orthodox Apologetics, the one that I wasn't present at, the 5, and then if you look at the True Western Orthodoxy podcast where I answered some of those questions, and then Father Joseph and I answered the question again like 2 weeks ago. So I mean,
Well, I mean, we can touch on it again, but let's.
all I wanted to say was that all I wanted to say was the Orthodox. Okay, fine. If we want to touch it again, let me just be very brief, and then you can add your points, and then we can move on, Father. There are very contrary forms of both civic. So, oh, my dogs are barking. So-called civic nationalism and ethno-nationalism have very contrary points to orthodoxy, because if the secular authority is placed above God, whether it's the survival of the ethnos, the race, or whatever or the nation, however it's composed, if that is the primary source and the primary origin of your thought, then you're not thinking in an orthodox way. So whether it's ethno-nationalism or civic nationalism, whatever, if you take that thought and you say orthodoxy is supreme and everything else must serve that, then my thinking is most of the issues that people will go away. But that's not what happens. Because you can have a form of civic nationalism like in the late Roman Empire under Diocletian, where the civic nationalism was everybody has to worship the spirits of the emperor and the worship of the emperor. It didn't matter what else you believe. That was a civic nationalism, completely incompatible. But then you have, but then you could have a form of ethnic nationalism where it's about the preservation of the ethnos. That's ultimately all that matters. And if that's all that matters, then that's just as much against orthodoxy as any form of civic nationalism. So, that's my answer, Father.
Well, I mean, I would agree with that. I think that, and that's part of the reason why I think it keeps coming up. I think that it has to be stressed. It has to be stressed ultimately that no matter what kind of nationalistic view you may have, that it must be subordinate to the teaching of God and the Church. If it is not subordinate to the teaching of God and the Church, then it is earthly. And if earthly problems will always come up with flawed earthly solutions, you will always continue having it'll be a continual cycle. And I think that that's one of the reasons why the question keeps coming up, because we have to keep on stressing ultimately that God comes first. And, I mean, for me, I've noticed that, there were like lots of discussions on the Jews. If you're focusing on the Jews, you're not focusing on yourself. People are not doing that anymore. And the problem is that we go in our society, in 21st century society, we've had a century of secular answers and secular claims and secular arguments, and God is missing from all of them. And unfortunately, even the things we say that are truthful, when it comes to things like that, are reinterpreted in this secularist lens, and it has to stop. You're never going to progress if you are looking into orthodoxy, or if you are orthodox, by focusing on earthly garbage. It will just never stop.
Because if you try to have any of these forms of civic or ethnic nationalism apart from the church, what's going to happen is you're going to invent a church anyway. You're going to invent a religion, and it's going to take the place of God in this form.
Exactly.
Whether it was the internationalist communism, or the National Socialism of European organizations, etc. Always exactly Nazi Germany. Well, I mean, you could think of other ones too. I mean, there were various other organizations that had that.
Ukraine,
Ukraine, but also the Ba'ath Party. I mean, there were similar groups, that did that. My point was that whatever you may think, well, they fought the communists or they did that, but the problem is ultimately they were just as much capable, because they did not have God and have orthodoxy, of doing terrible crimes as the internationalist socialists, the communists.
Yep.
All right, because they both came from the idea that it's either the preservation of the ethnic group, or the preservation of the international labor force, or whatever, the proletariat. That was the ultimate goal of everything. Right. Whereas the Orthodox concept of the state, as explicitly found in Romans 13 and throughout the Old Testament and of the Fathers, is the purpose of the state is to promote good and to restrain evil. Whatever is good must be promoted. Whatever is evil must be restrained. So, that's. I mean, most of these questions seem to have to only be arising in the 18th and 19th century, with the onset of the French Revolution and modernity and all these other problems.
Which itself is, by the way, a movement against God, because the entire, whether you look at it from the perspective of democracy, Freemasonry, wherever you want to look at it, it's always a movement towards man trying to perfect itself.
Yes, and in the case of the Freemasons, their view was that all religions, their outward view was that all religions were equal, or that we should all be friendly, but their inward view was that Masonry was the highest form.
Yeah,
And
exactly.
ultimately it was the this is why even in European lodges, a lot of the European lodges became explicitly atheistic. And because they were just more advanced. Well, supposedly the American lodges weren't atheistic, but who knows exactly the
Well, and
higher
that's
ups.
one of the things that I also wanted to clarify because people are like again, people then again we point secular fingers when you're looking at the whole. It's all the same. It's all the same modern enlightenment. We're going to abandon God sort of thing. I noticed in one of the previous podcasts, somebody was noting that maybe Freemasonry works with international Jewry. Well, surprise! Maybe you haven't heard of B'nai B'rith. B'nai B'rith is the infiltration of Freemasonry into Jewry as well, because everybody had to be controlled by this secular anti-God mentality, and that won't change.
And ultimately, they're all forces, or these forces are under the control of the devil. That's
Basically,
ultimately where it's all coming from. And so, you know, that seems to be.
I think that.
I mean, we can go over. You can listen to some of the previous podcasts if you want to have a more. You're going to have a much more specific question. The migrant issue in Europe.
Well, the migrant issue in Europe, I think, is it's not really it's not an well. See, it's tough because it's not.
We did that question on the Orthodoxy versus everyone.
Did we?
I think like 2 weeks ago we did all that. That's just an issue of people.
That's government. It's a government issue.
Yeah, exactly.
I mean, if it's not an Orthodox government, it's a government issue, and ultimately, granted, countries have the right to control migration. Whatever the EU's program is, I mean, I personally think it's demented, but in any case, whatever that plan is, it's a very secular plan. I don't buy.
It's a replacement plan, is really what it is.
Well, a demographic replacement
because they can't really control. They don't want to control the existing populations, or they can't control them sufficiently. So you bring in another population that can be manipulated.
Well, it's not even an issue of controlling them. It's an issue of the fact that demographics in Europe have been dropping like flies for decades, and that's partially because of their own policies.
Yes.
So the replacement is just, they could say that it's just to replace existing workforces. Of course, we could argue whether those existing workforces will be displaced by technology, but the point is that ultimately, you're still changing the character of the society. Now, does that mean that you're changing the character? Like, it would be a question for the Orthodox if you were changing an Orthodox society, but with the possible exception of Greece, and even that's questionable. It's not really an Orthodox question. It's just a social one.
Yes. Even though I'm assuming that, just for the sake of clarification, both of us do not think the mass migration of millions of Muslims into Europe is a positive thing.
Oh no, I think it's terrible. Exactly. But the point is that it's just.
But what in Europe is to oppose it? I mean, why
right.
is it?
It's not like the church is standing there, so
exactly. I mean, Europe has committed its own has committed. Remember what Saint Nikolai Veromirovich said, that the West in the past 1,000 years has not produced one substantive revelation or discovery of spirituality because it's lost its connection from the church.
Yeah.
And most of what you're seeing in Europe today is just the working out of all these things. It may have taken hundreds and hundreds of years for all this to come about, but it's finally here, and they've destroyed themselves.
Yeah.
So, and of course, Eastern Europe got destroyed because Russia and all these other countries imported all these Marxism and all these other ideologies, which are not even native ideologies to Russia.
Well, I will say this, because I think that it is an interesting question, and we have to look at it from the lens of 2,000 years. The last time you had a mass migration of Muslims into Europe, it led to the Reconquista and so on and so forth. But one thing that is interesting is that it couldn't eradicate Christianity completely the way it does in the way it has in certain areas of Africa and in the Middle East.
Like in North Africa, it eradicated North African Christianity was almost completely eradicated.
Yeah.
By the year 1000.
Right.
Except for a few bishoprics here and there, it was almost destroyed completely.
And so the point is that the fact is, history teaches us that no matter what they're doing, it's not necessarily hopeless unless the people choose for it to be hopeless. I was heartened by the fact that there are still, in Spain, you still have there are still women who traditionally wear their head coverings who are Christians and so on and so forth. And I believe that families of that sort may preserve Christianity as well as they can, as if they're Orthodox, and if not, they'll try to preserve their Catholicism, who knows. But the point is, it's not as simple as Muslims move in, automatically it's a caliphate. It's a much more long term process to
They
that.
may start fighting but they also may start fighting amongst each other. That happens in a lot of Muslim countries.
Oh, absolutely.
There's Islamic civil war among 2 or 3 different Islamic schools or whatever.
And that's usually how they end up, collapsing themselves.
Exactly.
So.
They take over. Exactly. The caliphates would have this humongous burst of energy, conquer an area, and then after they conquer the area, they at that point they began to settle down because they expended so much energy they couldn't invade anymore. And then all these internal fights and schisms began to happen, and then you have like 17 different guys claiming to be the caliph.
Yeah. So that it's not going to. History teaches us it's not going to work out as cut and dry.
And if you think you're going to kind of control millions of Muslims by bringing them into Europe, that's going to backfire on you. I don't think that's going to work out like some of these.
Yeah, and we have no idea how it's going to work. So, but again, it's a social question.
Yes.
It's a question for now. So we don't.
Okay, so Basil asks, but my point is that you can look at those questions. We've answered them at least a few times on the podcasts,
and we probably will again.
Exactly. Basil Politica says, an Orthodox author wrote something with a title like Saint Irenaeus' Presuppositional Apologetics.
I think Saint Irenaeus would have slapped him.
Yeah, I don't exactly know. I'd have to see what he means by that because I don't really know.
I'm afraid of just the fact that presuppositional apologetics being again a term that we see with Van Til, which is what I mean. I assume that's why you brought it up, Basil. Is basically I feel like it's again shoving our modern categories on the fathers.
Well, Basil brings the point. He says it's of course common in the Reformed tradition, that is the Presbyterian Calvinists. They think they are synthesizing and moving beyond the fathers. Well, that's the scholastic position. The scholastics thought the exact same way. And remember, people forget this. There's such a thing called Presbyterian and Lutheran scholasticism. They actually, even though Luther technically didn't like Aristotle and all this other stuff, he had very little influence actually on his own people. All right. And if you look at Calvin and then his successors and the successors, the Lutheran professors like Atubijah and all these other ones, by the late 1500s and the early 17th century, they had just created their own version of scholasticism, but it taught Presbyterianism or it taught Lutheranism. So that's ultimately how that goes. So. And that's oftentimes what you find with the scholastics. They seem to believe that they know better than the fathers. It's actually infuriating when you read something. So Basil asks, Saint Cyprian has 2 versions of one of his letters to Pope Saint Stephen, one with a longer, more exalted description of the papacy, and another with a less papal exaltation. Are both genuine? I think this is 2. Yeah, on the unity of the church, there are 2 versions of that. I think the oldest one is the one that actually has the less. Do you remember this, Father Joseph? It's like one of the versions has something like it has like a lot more titles to the papacy. Or
yeah, I do.
It's actually been shown to be erroneous or something like that by manuscript evidence.
Yeah, I mean, again, I said the longer version is generally not considered authoritative as the shorter one is. I have seen both of them. I think that even the longer one is not necessarily as much a great argument for the papacy as one would assume. I would say, in all honesty, the short one is the one I would regard. I'd look at the longer one with a little more suspicion, but even then, I'd still read it because, frankly, from what I understand, it certainly doesn't say what a lot of Roman Catholic apologists are saying. I've used both of them in discussion. It doesn't.
I think the Father Vladimir Guite in his book, The Papacy, actually addresses this issue, and he brings to the same point. I mean, even in the longer version, whoever added those words in there, they're essentially just. They're not going much beyond the papal claims of the mid 4th century.
Certainly, neither of them precludes what happened between Saint Cyprian and Pope.
Exactly, where they broke communion with each other at one point.
Well, and so the long one says Peter is the rock of the church. Well, that's fine, but Peter's faith, whether you want to call Peter or Peter's faith the rock of the church, that doesn't make either of them the Pope. It's still talking about the faith of the church. It's just not.
Yeah, why? If Peter's the rock of the church, why is he the rock of the church?
Yeah.
Because of his faith, his confession of the Orthodox faith.
I don't know that it could. I'm going to look at the longer version again, Basil, while if there are other questions. But I'm pretty sure that Peter and the papacy are not equated. This is something that is very rarely, very commonly misrepresented. But I have no problem with looking at the longer and shorter versions. I've looked at both of them for 20 years. It doesn't bother me. But I'll get the longer version on the unity of the church. But we'll examine it here because it doesn't. Again, I've seen it before.
I'd like to bring up another point while you're looking that up, Father.
Sure, go ahead.
There's a consistent misinterpretation of our Lord's Prayer in John 17, which states, where our Lord prays that, they all may be one.
Yep.
And there's a consistent misunderstanding that this somehow means that all heresies and schisms, Christ is praying for all heresies and schisms, when in fact he's praying for the apostles that they may continue in concord with each other, being within the church. And I just posted a link to an article about this subject. I wish people would stop using this because they absolutely have really no idea what they're talking about when they pretend that they may all be one is some sort of ecumenistic prayer. You never find that interpretation anywhere until what? I don't know, like the 1600s or something like that, or 1700s in some of the Protestant organizations.
Mm-hmm.
So,
all right. Well, I'm looking at the longer version of On the Unity of the Church. I presume it's the longer version. It's the one on the New Advent site, which is the Catholic edition. And we'll just read from section 2, which is the one in question.
Can you put the link in the chat?
Yeah, I can put the link in the chat. That's no problem. Give me 1 second. And then ultimately, it's paragraph 4 is what we're looking at. It's, hold on. Let me see here. So we put that there in the chat there so you can take a look at it. All right. So the one in question is, of course, number 4, and it says, if anyone can consider and examine these things, there's no need for lengthened discussions and arguments. There is easy proof for faith and a short summary of the truth. The Lord speaks to Peter, saying, I say unto you that you are Peter, and upon this rock I will build my church, and the gates of hell shall not prevail against it. And I will give unto you the keys of the kingdom of heaven. Whatsoever you bind on earth shall also be bound in heaven, and whatsoever you loose on earth shall be loosed in heaven. And again to the same he says after his resurrection, feed my sheep. And although to all the apostles after his resurrection, he gives an equal power and says, as the Father has sent me, even so I send you. Receive the Holy Ghost. Whosoever sins you remit, they be remitted unto him. Whosoever sins you retain, they be retained. Yet that he might set forth the unity, he arranged his authority. The origin of that unity is beginning from one. Assuredly, the rest of the apostles were also the same as Peter, endowed with a like partnership both of honor and power. But the beginning proceeds from unity. Which one church also the Holy Spirit in the Song of Songs designated in the person of our Lord. My dove, my spotless one, is but one. She is but only one of her mother, elect of her that bare her. Does he who does not hold this unity of the church think that he holds the faith? Does he who strives against and resists the church trust that he is in the church, when moreover the blessed apostle Paul teaches the same thing and sets forth the sacrament of unity, saying there is one body and one spirit, one hope of your calling, one Lord, one faith, one baptism, one God. Literally, that is the controversial, quote-unquote, part of the longer version of St. Cyprian's epistle. And I don't see a proof for Rome in it. One could argue that one is saying, well, the point of unity would therefore be Rome, etc. That I don't know that that's necessarily true, because he seems to put the unity of the apostles higher than he does unity with Rome. He doesn't even mention Rome, to be quite honest with you. So you could very well be talking about the Patriarchate of Antioch. But the point is, it's not saying anything that is necessarily bad. I think it's simply speaking, and this is something that St. Apatis has covered a few times with Malevis, when he's talking against many of the same people that St. Cyprian is talking about, and he brings that up too, is that they're outside of the unity of the church. And that
I think what people are going to say is that because St. Cyprian is using St. Peter as a type, kind of
but it's such a qualified type. He keeps on
exactly.
In this, he says, and although to all the apostles he gives an equal power, and then he goes even further and says, assuredly the rest of the apostles were also the same as with Peter, endowed with a like partnership of power and honor and power. I don't see, he seems to be talking about the unity of the apostles more than he's talking about any specific gift of St. Peter. But if we talk about the gift of St. Peter, it has to be his faith. I don't see how this is a great apologetic for Rome, certainly unless you hold the presupposition already that Rome is the center of unity, which is not what St. Cyprian is saying at all.
Yes. Well, of course, this later evolves by the 1600s into the ridiculous view that you find among some Roman Catholic apologists and polemicists in the 1400s and 1500s and 1600s that St. Peter actually ordained all the apostles. I don't know if you've ever encountered that before.
Yeah, no, I
That claim that this means
I think
that.
that actually that's not. I don't know if that was either Louis de Montfort or Alphonsus Liguori. I forget which one began asking the theoretical question: did Saint Peter make the other apostles? No, he didn't. That's just crazy. And but that was the extreme that they took it, where they just ignored the meanings of the scripture and the tradition itself.
Okay, another random question is it a common post-fall of Constantinople teaching that the fall is due to the continued unia of the Paleologus dynasty? Well, I think that actually, during the fall of Constantinople, people were blaming the fall of Constantinople on the unia. So that's not just something they came up with after the fall of it. Now, supposedly, there are all these legends that the emperor, like supposedly an hour before he died, renounced the unia. I don't know if that's true or not. That could just be, there's the view of the emperor. I've heard this from some older Greeks that the Byzantine that they never found the body of the emperor, and that's because God hid it in the earth, and he's going to be resurrected or brought back.
The Marble King.
Yeah, basically, it's almost like King Arthur. It's a King Arthur type legend.
Yeah.
And people kind of laugh at the King Arthur stuff, but you find this among among a lot of people. Like there are some versions, I think, of the White Tsar legend, which is supposedly same one of them that's going to come back or something like that. But that's a little bit different. But I mean, I remember distinctly hearing that from like some 90-year-old Greek cantor, like 20, I don't know, almost 15 years ago. That the king is going to come out of the walls of the church of Hagia Sophia. And because all the priests had kind of melted into the walls, and they're going to come out, and he's going to conquer everything, and going to restore the Roman Empire and things like that, and all the rest. But it is a common. I think it was a teaching before that. I think the Russians and Muscovy were saying that Constantinople was going to fall, even in the 1440s and in the early 1450s before it fell. So I think it's not necessarily It's not a post facto explanation. People were saying, "Oh no, God's going to destroy the city because of the apostasy." That's what happened. So another question from Basil is Ultramontanism a settled dogmatic question for papists? A papist friend implied otherwise, much to my surprise. And then Atomic Lead says, Basil, yes, Ultramontanism and quote unquote Catholicism are virtually synonymous. Well, yes, I believe that Ultramontanism is. You can. Add your thoughts here, Father Joseph. Ultramontanism is a settled view for the papists. All this stuff about conciliarism and all the rest, that's been coming up only since the 60s and 70s.
That's exactly what I was going to say. The idea that your papist friend implying otherwise, Basil, is influenced by Vatican II. And that's great because Ultramontanism is wrong, but the simple reality is his church's history does not reflect it for the past 900 or so years.
For example, there's been attempts to try to reinterpret Pastor Aeternus, so it doesn't really mean what it means.
Right.
I mean, it's just one thing after the other, because I think they kind of realize they put themselves in a bad position concerning history eventually. And, and if you look at it, Vatican I, when it had these decrees about papal infallibility, I remember how the Pope put his foot on the Melkite Patriarch's head. You remember all that stuff that went on there. If you can think of that actually in a political context, because a lot of the papacy, a lot of its doctrines are actually politically motivated fundamentally, that the papacy had lost by 1870 almost all of the Italian properties that it controlled. The papal states had been conquered by Garibaldi and King Emmanuel and all the rest. And so that's when you start seeing things like the Feast of Christ the King becoming more and more prominent, because it was ultimately to emphasize partially the temporal sovereignty of the Pope. They don't talk about that. That was a lot to do with some of the stuff. And the other point was that what better way to spit in the face of the people taking over Italy than to say, well, look, the Pope is now he can issue infallible declarations, and you have to believe that as a matter of faith. So I don't really see it as anything optional. But to be honest, you can be in the Roman Catholic Papist Church and believe almost anything nowadays and not get punished.
Yeah, ultimately, and ironically,
it's a weird situation where on the books they have Ultramontanism, but then again, you can believe almost anything as long as you recognize the Pope.
But that's exactly the point. The fact that it is the only thing that you really need to believe more than anything else is the ultimate proof that Ultramontanism is still the doctrine of their church.
Yeah, I mean, if you can have that that one I saw on the news, that one crazy nun going around, and she was like saying how abortion wasn't a really big issue and the church needs to stop talking about it. Well, Pope Francis said the same thing, by the way. But you have that one, and then you have the FSSP, the kind of the SSSPX group that joined the Vatican. How can they be, supposedly you can have two diametrically and dogmatically opposed organizations both being allowed to operate freely in the same body? That should tell you something about what that body actually thinks about doctrine. And that what they think ultimately is that as long as you recognize Francis or whoever the guy sitting in the Vatican is, as long as you recognize him as the Pope, everything else ultimately doesn't really matter.
Well, I mean, there's even, you find Jesuits who are, doing Hinduism now. Yeah. So it's like, there's so much.
That's why all these arguments from Roman Catholic apologists, I really don't take as seriously as I used to. I mean, they're kind of arguing from an abstract perspective that doesn't really exist anymore.
Yeah, and I think that part of the problem is that syncretic view that you find in Roman Catholicism is particularly why these RC apologists can't understand why we wouldn't simply join them. I mean, everyone else has.
Yeah, you can believe whatever you want to believe. Why shouldn't you join, right?
Exactly, but that's the point is we wouldn't join with anyone who, as Orthodox, who doesn't share the Orthodox faith. So it's exactly that's the issue.
So Basil says, to what extent was clerical celibacy practiced in the West prior to the Hildebrands reforms? I know Trullo permits this practice among barbarians. But what's the reference there? Now, Trullo, what? Trullo does not. Trullo permits does not. Where does Trullo permit clerical? I'm not trying to argue with Basil here, but as I recall, the 102 canons of Trullo, one of them mentions, one or two of them mention the issue of marriage in the clergy, and I believe one of them says that you have to be married before being made a subdeacon.
I think you're looking at it from the wrong perspective, Father. Well, what I mean by that is I think he's assuming that Trullo permitted the practice of celibacy, and the point is not the practice of marriage. Trullo did enforce the practice of marriage. The question is, in other words, clerical celibacy was not nearly as widespread before Hildebrand's reforms, if we want to call it that.
If he means did Trullo say an unmarried man could be made a subdeacon, a deacon, and a priest? I don't think it really disputes that can happen, but it's not mandating clerical celibacy. So right. This is a Roman Catholic argument you still find among some Roman Catholics, you can find remnants of this. There's this Cardinal Sarah, who's this African cardinal in the Vatican, who kind of brings it up every now and again. But also you find it among people like what's his name, that one English Richard Williamson kind of brings this up every now and again, and they say basically clerical celibacy was the de facto norm, and that it was only around the time of the Council of Trullo that the East began to allow married men to continue to be married men and live with their wives and be priests.
Yeah, which isn't really.
Yeah, that is not true, because if you look at one of the canons, I have them bringing up right here actually, but there was a canon of Trullo. There are two canons of Trullo that actually censure things going on in Rome. They, in a very, very moderated way, because they're still in communion with them, obviously. But here's what what they say. I can look it up here and I can post it. Go to Rome from the Quintus Sex Council. Let's see, marriage. Okay. All right. So in the Sixth Ecumenical Council, so-called, it's not so-called, but the Council of Trullo in, I think it's Canon. Okay, so that in Canon 13 of the Council of Trullo, held in 692, it states the following: since we have learned that in the Church of the Romans, it is regarded as tantamount to a canon that ordinands to the deaconry or the presbytery must solemnly promise to have no further intercourse with their wives. Continuing, however, in conformity with the ancient canon of apostolic rigorism and orderliness, we desire that henceforth the lawful marriage ties of sacred men and become stronger, and we are no wise dissolving their intercourse with their wives, nor depriving them of their mutual relationship and companionship when properly maintained in due season. So that if anyone is found to be worthy to be ordained a subdeacon or a deacon or a presbyter, let him no wise be prevented from being elevated to such a rank while cohabitating with a lawful wife, nor must he be required at the time of ordination to refrain from lawful intercourse with his own wife, lest we be forced to be downright scornful of marriage, which is instituted by God and blessed by his presence, as attested by the unequivocal the declaration of the gospel utterance, Well, therefore God hath joined together, let no man put asunder. And the apostles' teaching, marriage is honorable and the bed is undefiled. And art thou bound unto a wife, seek not to be freed. We are cognizant, though, that those who met in Carthage and made provision of the decency in the life of ministers declared that subdeacons and deacons and presbyters, busy themselves as they do with the sacred mysteries, according to their rules, are obliged to practice temperance in connection with their helpmates, in order that we may likewise keep the injunction handed down through the apostles and continued from ancient times in force, well knowing that there is a proper season for everything, and especially for fasting and praying. For those who assist in the ceremonies at the sacrificial altar have to be temperate in all things at the time when they are handling holy things, so that they may be able to gain whatever they ask God for. If, therefore, anyone acting contrary to the apostolic canons requires any person who is in sacred orders, any presbyter, we mean, or deacon or subdeacon, to abstain from intercourse and association with his lawful wife, let him be deposed from office. Likewise, if any presbyter or deacon expel his own wife on the pretext of reverence, let him be excommunicated, and if he persists, let him be deposed from office. So the canon, basically, that's extremely explanatory. Basil says the West accepted Trullo for a time. No, not really. You did have one council in Spain, like the last of the councils of Toledo, which was what, the 17th Council of Toledo, or something like that.
Council.
Yeah, that did technically accept Trullo because the king, a lot of the bishops had some sort of alliance with the Byzantine emperor. They did accept it, but it should be noted that in Rome itself, they never accepted it.
Well,
let me say they did accept it. But what they would say is they accepted it except for those two canons. There's that canon and another canon about fasting on Saturdays.
Right.
And they were always and what happened is you do find Pope St. Adrian speaking of the canons of Trullo as the canons of the Holy Ecumenical Sixth Council. So they did have a very high authority by the 780s and such.
Well, what I was going to say, Father, was simply that one thing that we need to keep clear here is that the canons don't establish tradition; they codify tradition that's already there. So to answer the question, even if Rome didn't accept Trullo, that's not dealing with the fact that they did accept married priests. They did have married priests throughout the West in every area. There's no denial of that. And they had monastic priests, so on and so forth. So the idea of enforced clerical celibacy, it still largely remains something new with Hildebrand. It wasn't like they suddenly said, well, we are appealing to the Council of Trullo or something.
But I think what will happen is people will read, for example, an encyclical or a decree by Pope St. Siricius in the 380s or the 390s. And there was one, and it will say that married men who are deacons and priests must not sleep with their wives. But if you read many of these decretals, like by Pope Siricius and others, one of the excuse for that is explicit. He says, one, how can they sleep with their wives if they're going to be at the divine sacrifice every single day? Because there is a presupposition. This is part of the problem that gets complicated, that if you were presupposing that everybody was supposed to be doing mass every single day, then effectively you're going to have a white marriage. There's no other real way around it.
Yeah.
And the other problem is this. Traditionally, when a priest had to celebrate mass, let's say in the East, and it was not just one day he separated from his wife. It could be as many as 2 or 3 days. Because you have Friday, you can't sleep with Saturday, and then some would even include Thursday. So that means, that was why oftentimes they like to have 2 or 3 priests at one church for those reasons.
Right.
So, I mean, a lot of this is that if a priest is going to be celebrating twice a week, then he's not going to be, and he's by himself, sleeping with his wife is going to be canonically prohibited. It's just going to be a problem. Yes, you will find so here's the problem. You will find decrees that were one of the books and papal decrees that were never enforced that state that a married man should not sleep with his wife if he is a priest. But however, notice it says a married man. All right. So it's assuming you're ordaining married people to be deacons and priests to begin with. So that's a little bit different than the Hildebrandian reform, where they're like, let's just get rid of, not ordain anybody who's married to begin with, just.
And then on top of that, accuse all the married priests of being
of being adulterers, while the ones promoting clerical celibacy are involved in the worst depravities.
Right.
So
which was Ulrich of Romola's argument.
Exactly. So what extent was clerical celibacy practiced in the West prior to Hildebrand? It had a theoretical appeal, and it was practiced in a theoretical sense in some places, but for the vast majority of priests, bishops did not enforce those decrees by the popes. They just simply allowed a married man to be made a deacon and a priest. That was how everything went. It was not until the Gregorian reforms that this became a big issue. I suppose it's like, imagine if I guess the one argument would be, well, if they had these papal decrees or decrees by some council in Italy or whatever, saying that a deacon or priest shouldn't sexually cohabitate with his wife, how can that be? How can that be? And will they not allow it? It's like a conflict between two different canons or practices. But if you think about it in a certain way, it's not that dissimilar to other canons in Trullo. For example, there are canons in Trullo which state explicitly that a monk must have his hair cut short, and so must other clergy. All right, that there are actually canons about keeping a very short hair tonsure. Now, imagine if a Greek or a Russian bishop today went around to all of his clergy and said, "You see this canon in Trullo, and you see all the commentaries. It says monks and clergy must have a short hair, and they must have their tonsure must be kept exact." All right. Now, there would be a lot of outrage if any bishop tried to apply those in a lot of the Greek and Russian places, all right? Even though technically you could point to a canon where it says that. So oftentimes that's kind of the situation I think that happened in the West. A lot of people knew the previous tradition that had been going on for centuries of having married men made deacons and priests. Then you have a papal decree saying something different, and they just simply choose not to obey the papal decree because it's, it didn't really, from their perspective, it didn't really have... It didn't have any force. I mean, if they believed in papal supremacy and infallibility, then the Pope's decree should have been obeyed everywhere and acknowledged, but apparently it wasn't. So, I'm not sure if I
I think that was pretty complete.
Okay. Is it demonstrable beyond doubt that John VIII affirmed the 879-880 Council, Father Joseph?
Well, demonstrable beyond doubt. Whenever we get to questions like that, it becomes, we start hair splitting. The simple reality is Pope John VIII was the one who put up the plates with the filioque removed.
No, that's Leo III.
I thought it was John VIII.
No, Leo III put the plates up. That was done in the 790s. Late 790s.
All right. Well, on that one, then I would be, because I could have sworn that you see, now I was actually going to cite Romanitas, which is funny because he said John VIII. But
I don't know if he did that.
That answers that next question. But
I'm serious. That is Leo III put up the plates.
So, John VIII recognized St. Photius, and I would presume recognized the validity of his acts. From what I understood, the 879-880 Council was never called into dispute as the Eighth Council until after the 11th century, and I think we covered that last week.
Yeah, I think it was around the year 1100. The problem is that a lot of times what happened at the Council of Constantinople in 879-880 is similar to what happened at the Council of Nicaea II in 787, called the Seventh Ecumenical Council. That is, both Pope John VIII and Pope St. Hadrian, respectively, sent their delegates to the council. They had pre-prepared statements about what they wanted to be read and what they wanted to be done. However, as always happens when a pope's representatives go to an ecumenical council, the other bishops and the other people in the back room, so to doubt, kind of when they're planning the council, there's a lot of negotiations going behind the scenes. What happens is they say that, look, if you can't get your entire way, you can't get your full what you want, you're going to have to make some sort of compromise. And for example, at the Seventh Ecumenical Council, Pope Saint Hadrian wanted all of southern Italy, all of Sicily, all of Greece and Macedonia, and all these areas that have been taken away from Rome's technical jurisdiction, placed back into it. They never got that, nor did they get that at the Eighth Ecumenical Council, which John VIII had asked for. But when the delegates came back and they said, look, we got the main stuff, we're back in communion, we got the Orthodox faith affirmed, we got all that main stuff, St. Adrian or John VIII may have not liked the fact that they didn't get everything they wanted passed, but they did not choose to break communion with either St. Tiresias or St. Photius. And they did not choose to publicly condemn and anathematize either the Seventh Ecumenical Council or the Eighth Ecumenical Council, because they were to realize to do that would have just been to perpetuate a schism and division. So, is it demonstrable beyond a doubt that John VIII affirmed the 879-880 Council? Well, he continued communion with St. Photius, and he didn't anathematize him. So, as Father Joseph, you bring up that point. To me, that's the best evidence, correct?
Yeah, and the fact that it stayed that way for another 200 years or so tells me that basically it was common knowledge that was an acceptable council.
Yep.
It didn't come into question until until Hildebrand. Again, everything comes back. It's terrifying, that we talk about this. That everything comes back to Hildebrand in the late 11th century, but it does. You can really trace the roots of everything in terms of the division between Rome and itself and Rome and the East, right there. It's like
I mean, for example, there were better relations, both ecclesiastical and civil, between the Ottonian German Empire in the 10th century and the Byzantine Roman Empire than between the papacy and Constantinople. I mean, for example, the 10th century. So, they were both in communion. Remember, one of the nieces of the Byzantine emperor married the son of one of the Ottonian emperors. They were having exchange of embassies going back and forth, celebrating in each other's churches. And they were very good. Well, everybody was kind of ignoring Rome for most of the 10th century because it was considered a cesspit.
Well, that's
it was a cesspit.
Well, it's interesting. And I keep, I've spent a lot of time thinking about this fact, the whole radical Hildebrandian change. And one of the things that I was looking around about, and I noticed when I was looking in the period of the real Dark Ages, the pornocracy, and that period of the papacy. And one of the things I noticed was the rise of the cadaver synod.
Formosus being tried by Stephen VI, I believe.
Right, after his death. And the
late 80s.
Well, now, this is what gets me as interesting, is that this would have been well before Hildebrand was alive. And after the cadavercism, of course, Pope Formosus' body was thrown in the Tiber. And then the next pope actually anathematized the cadaver synod and so on and so forth.
Do you know what happened? Do you know just before?
They found his body. Yeah.
Do you know what happened when they brought it into when they brought it into the basilica?
No.
When they brought his body into the basilica, the priests and the monks who carried his body said all the icons, the mosaics, began to turn and to sing, proclaiming that Formosus was a saint. And that was one of the reasons that even after he died, it was just they began. Remember, they could not deny the sanctity of Formosus.
Yeah, so even though they tried to throw him in the river, that eventually the people found his body and took it out.
Exactly.
But now the reason I find this interesting is because after the cadaver synod was overturned, there was another such synod. I forget which pope it was that got thrown in the river, and then eventually was exhumed again. But it got me thinking about the whole Hildebrandian thing, and I can't help but think that if he was reading in that that period of the 100 years before him, with this obsession with regaining Petrine authority, so on and so forth, that he kept on seeing these cadaver synods and then seeing that they were overturned as anti-canonical, and in the case of Pope St. Formosus, were evil, and that he kind of felt like he had to do it almost. And so, he ends up effectively what he did to, Pope Clement III was another cadaver synod, and this time he wanted to establish that nobody could challenge it.
But remember, the problem with Clement III was that they had to wait till he died. One, two, they had to overthrow they had to install a friendly government in Ravenna to begin with, because and three, then they had to destroy his tomb because his tomb was being venerated with miracles.
But that's exactly my point, is that in what we would think is utter insanity, it's possible that, again, and I was just thinking about psychologically profiling Hildebrand, and maybe I shouldn't, but maybe he thought that was his right, or maybe he thought that was the right of popes to begin with, even though the rest of the church was saying it wasn't.
Yeah, and if you look in several of the German and the French bishops in the 10th century, whenever the issue of the cadaver synod was well known, and it was thought to be absolutely disgusting and blasphemous.
Yeah,
and for example, the French archbishops oftentimes brought this up, and they would simply say that if the Pope claims to be the president among all bishops, then he needs to act like it, and that is he needs to obey the canons, and he needs to have a good moral life, because how is he supposed to have any authority to tell us anything if he doesn't obey the canons to begin with?
Yep. And
his life is completely immoral. And when they brought up the case of the supposed saying of Pope Gelasius about nemo primum judicabit, no one may judge the first see, Archbishop Arnulf of Orleans, I believe, said something like, well, I've never heard that, but if that's true, then that doesn't mean that then he needs to be a respectable man to begin with. Two, his judgment needs to be according to equity. So
Yeah.
even when they brought up this supposedly the gotcha phrase of Gelasius, I don't know if it's really, I mean, people attribute it to him. Even when they bring that up, they did not interpret that in an absolutist way. No more than when St. Paul says, parents, obey your children. It doesn't mean the parents can say, well, okay, son, go rob the liquor store.
Right.
You know, or, lie to your mother and just don't tell her what I said. They don't have authority to make you do immoral things or break the laws. And how much more so if the bishop, if the Pope is claiming to be the brother bishop among all the other metropolitans and other bishops. So that's kind of it's kind of important, and they had to overcome that attitude for a very long time, and they eventually did by getting rid of the bishops who didn't agree with them. I mean, that's the best way to overcome those attitudes, because then you don't have those attitudes. The people are dead, or especially if you start ordaining celibate men who are dependent upon the bishop who ordained them.
Yeah.
That's another very scary thing to actually think. If you look at Ulrich of Imola, his implication was that the bishops were ordaining people, celibate priests, that were also immoral. Because then what are they going to do? They're going to turn around and expose you when you know what they, you know what I mean? It's like a blackmail type. Like, that's common in politics, that you put, like, for example, there's I know this kind of relates years and years ago. There was a Speaker of the House called Dennis Hastert.
Oh,
And
I remember him.
exactly. And here's what was weird. He went from like a high school football coach to like a member of the local Illinois House of Representatives to the next 2 years later being a member of the U.S. House of Representatives. Then like the next year being Speaker of the House. That had never happened before. You know why it happened? Because they had blackmail on him about him molesting children, and they knew he was controllable. He was a controllable figure. All right. He later spent a few years in prison, and things like that. But I think that's also what they did during the Hildebrandian reform. According to, if you look at Ulrich of Imola's letters against them, all right, because of course all these Hildebrandian bishops were saying stuff like, well, at least we do this in private. It was.
And well, unfortunately, we're now seeing that the full results of that in the 21st century.
Exactly.
The next question we have here, I hope that helped. Atomic Lead Basil asks, is there anything of value in Romanides' works? Could you give a critical appraisal?
I think Vladimir Moss actually wrote a very good 100-page monograph on Romanides' works.
Yeah,
I thought he was as fair as you could be considering Romanides. That's my opinion.
Yeah, I mean, I was a big fan of Romanides when I first converted to Orthodoxy. In fact, I wrote when I was in one of the local community colleges. I wrote a paper basically arguing for Romanides, and the professor was like, I forget, some kind of scholar, one of these traveling scholars like a Fulbright or something, immediately gave me an A+ for it. I assume because of the conspiratorial bent. But the reality is, over time, what I began to realize is that Romanides, for all his positives, taught a lot of things that, unfortunately, I guess you could say, are almost standard renovationist to the right teachings. And what I mean by that is, if we talk about, Father Seraphim Rose, he talks about renovationists from the right. A lot of them hold to the teachings of Romanides in terms of things like denial of hell as a real place as opposed to the river of fire. A number of teachings on his unique teachings on psychology, his rejection of St. Augustine, so on and so forth. The problem is that in some ways Romanides, and this is where I think Moss is especially helpful, is that he points out some of the errors that you find in Romanides historically. One of which, when he's talking about, Charlemagne's empire, Romanides tends to just dismiss all the groups as simply Franks versus Romans, who are, now considered historically Greeks. And the problem is, it's a very nationalistic viewpoint, and it sounds great when you start out from a conspiratorial bent, but eventually what you realize is, if you're really assessing Western Orthodox history, it stops making sense. At some points, Romanides basically argues for the Monophysites. At some points, he inadvertently argues for the Muslims. He
has a positive attitude towards Luther, for example.
Yeah, he tends towards seeing everything Western as bad. and that everything.
And then if you're a rebel toward the Western scholasticism, somehow that means you're good.
Right, and so he had a very unique view on the American Revolution, which he considered to be almost, almost pious, because he considered it to be.
In the French Revolution, he supported the French Revolution.
Right, basically saying that the people were taking back their Roman history because of the incorrect theory that basically everyone of the entire populace was actually ethnically Roman/Greek to begin with. It's just it's a lot of it. Some of the stuff is good. It's good to read his footnotes for historical data.
Now, I believe he was correct. I've come around to one view that he was correct on, and that is he was correct about the Great Schism being catastrophism. That is that it was more than a slow buildup.
Right. He does not.
Now he's wrong in saying I think he puts too much emphasis upon the fact that the Franks took over the papacy, because a lot of times Hildebrand was fighting German and French bishops.
Well, and I think
that distorts I'm saying that distorts some of the good he was because he was positing about, they were invading the Anglo-Saxons and they were trying to take over and destroy the Anglo-Saxon church to impose the Gregorian reform, and he's correct about that.
Yeah.
But he forgets that among the average Frankish and German person, they weren't that culturally different than Anglo-Saxon. All right.
And that's a problem that he overemphasizes this whole Roman versus Frankish thing. It's just it's a little too much. I agree with his catastrophism. He tends to see it as the schism starting in 1014 and that's it when they put a Frank in office. I don't think it's that simple. But in general, I'd say, again, he's someone I'd read with a grain of salt. There are better sources, but he's always an interesting start to anyone on their journey to Orthodoxy. But eventually, you grow out of it.
I mean, at best, if you don't grow out of it, you become insane. So
yeah. So we go to the next question, which is: should Orthodox use the Textus Receptus or the critical text of the New Testament? What arguments can you give for either?
Well, the Textus Receptus is what's called the Byzantine majority text.
Right, yeah.
And that's basically what the Douay-Rheims New Testament and the King James New Testament are based on, essentially. The Vulgate New Testament has a little bit of a variation. Right. But, there's, like, for example, there are some places in the book of Acts where the Vulgate actually has, like, an extra word here or there. But that's not that much different. A lot of times the so-called critical text that what they're talking about are things like the Alexandrian and the Sinaitic text, which have problems because they're notorious for missing manuscript pages, degraded manuscripts. I think the Byzantine majority text is what's been used among all translations in some variety or another. So what arguments can you give for either? Well, that the church has chosen the Byzantine majority text, essentially. I think that's the best argument. I think you can probably look at other editions, and you can learn from them, but that doesn't mean they should take priority over what the church has chosen, right, Father?
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think that the question of what should they use is kind of secondary to what they do use. Again, we're Orthodox because we have such a rich tradition. The question of correct Bible versions is a secondary question. And what I mean by that is that that's a very important question if the Bible is everything you base your life on, which is why it makes such a huge deal to Protestants. And, Roman Catholics eventually joined in on it in the 1960s with Divino Affolante Spiritu. But the point is, ultimately, the church has a tradition of what text it uses. We should take into account other texts. All of the fathers who dealt with translating scripture, etc., did take other texts into account, all the way back to St. Jerome. But the point is, we also must bear in mind what the church has always historically used. So I would say that, your central argument is what the church used is a sufficient argument. I would say that that's true. And I would say that I wouldn't be terribly concerned about it. And where there is a difference, I would give precedence to the text that's always been used by the church. It's also a great argument for traditional translations. I know that the new translations, some of them based on the critical text, I'm thinking of the New American Bible here, are just prosaic. They lack, but that's true of modern translations in general. They seem to lack a sense of fervor for the truth that you find in older translations. So they
often make a pedestrian translation.
Yeah, it's really, a lot of the times it's weak. The closest that you come to anything in modern translations that might have been any good might have been the Jerusalem Bible, but even that goes so far off the mark sometimes that it's just not worth it. I think that's a great argument, by the way, for using older translations, only because they've stood for the test of time. They're usually pretty good. You can produce critical editions if you want, but the point is...
And also, you can always take a King James, a Dewey Reams, a Lancelot Britton Septuagint translation, and 2 or 3 others, and if you want to do a study, you can compare all the different traditional texts.
Yeah, and you'll find
that's what I do. You know?
Yeah, and I think that's not necessarily a bad thing. I mean, St. John of Damascus did the same. There's nothing wrong with that, but I wouldn't get too worried about which texts we should use and just focus on the ones we do use, and then use the scriptures in your everyday life.
Speaking of Atomic Lead asks, speaking of the text of the River of Fire, do you think Calamiros, at least, excuse me, has a point about the West's current state as a revolt against its own bad theology? I think that, in a certain way, he's actually right about that, because look at countries look at the formerly the most Calvinist countries in Europe: Scotland and the Netherlands. All right, and Scotland, for example, is considered one of the essentially the most secular, non-religious countries in Europe. All right, so I think there's a point about that. If you perceive of God as this hateful creature who's looking to predestine most of mankind to damnation, and he doesn't care about you, and that people can't have a psychological rejection of that. Well, I think that is true, but I think Calamiros goes over to a point where he says stuff about, well, the French say the good God when they're talking about God.
Yeah, love on you.
Yeah, like supposedly that somehow is evil for them to say that. But it's talking about
it like he's saying like the good God is almost a curse. I mean, the thing is, Calamiros, well, he was actually referring to atheism as a revolt against the West's own bad theology. I don't think that he starts off from a very good presupposition. And what I mean by that is I don't think that his assumption is that atheism is a response to the bad theology of the West. But the problem is that if that's true, then there would be no atheists in place. There would be no atheists in places where there's good theology. And atheism has existed at least, almost as long as religion itself.
But it's only been in the 20th century that it actually got big, because if you look at
promoted,
yes, because even in the classical world, you would find atheists every now and again, but they were extremely small. It was that's why a lot of times people just thought their arguments were so ridiculous.
Well, and their arguments still are ridiculous.
Exactly.
But one thing that we should point out is that Calamiros in the Touchstone also noted that Greece is no more. And so one thing that I do want to make clear is that Calamiros' position, as romantic as it may sound towards the East versus the West, when taken as a whole in his own writings, he realized that the modern world, whether it be Western or Eastern, was already so far detached from God, so far detached from the spirit of truth, that it was corrupted. It was.
And remember, Calamiros actually had, of those who were associated with kind of the so-called right-wing renovationist movement,
yeah.
Calamiros was probably the least bad, and I say that because he had a lot of association with Father Seraphim Rose.
He got into a lot of arguments with Father Seraphim.
Exactly, and you're right, and he did it over the evolution question, because Calamiros promoted Darwinian evolution and was an ally of Boston. But I'm just saying, Father Seraphim did find a lot of useful things in Calamiros, though.
Yeah, but he also forcefully answered Calamiros, and Calamiros eventually sided with Lazar Pahalo. So I can't agree.
Oh yeah, you're right. I forgot about that. I'm sorry. And also remember, Calamiros ended up getting in the big fight with Archbishop Exentius over the Holy Trinity icon, and he left and going to any church, and he had his own chapel with his family.
And that chapel eventually went back under Lazar Pahalo.
Yeah,
that's my point.
And so you're right. I spoke too soon, but I guess there's really not a lot of good you can find in a lot of these people, unfortunately.
Unfortunately, the luminaries, and this is funny because Father Seraphim Rose is held up so badly. A lot of people in modern Orthodoxy look badly upon him, but he answered all of these great leaders, and they were not that great. They had problems, and eventually, people began to look at them more critically.
Yeah, look if you look at how it happened. Look, Lazar Pahalo, Hochner, Calamiros, everybody that came against Father Seraphim, that attacked him as this nobody. They called him unbaptized, that he wasn't really ordained, all this other stuff. What happened to them? Everything they built collapsed and turned to ashes. ultimately,
Yeah, pretty
or
much.
it was exposed as a corrupted evil. But
Yeah.
what Father Seraphim he wrote and what he tried to build. I mean, yes, you have the stuff about Father what's his name that later went to the Pangratia stuff, whatever. But Father Seraphim's legacy in terms of his writings, I can't help but see that it was overall a very positive thing because he was trying to transmit orthodoxy. He wasn't trying to transmit his own special interpretation of it, his own angle and bent on things. But if he read that the fathers all said this, then that was his opinion. That was what the fathers said. That was his opinion. It wasn't going to be him taking some Greek or Russian theologian of 1935 and saying, well, he had a different interpretation.
Well, it's worth noting the whole Father Herman thing happened after he died.
Yes, exactly. You're right. But my point is that what made Father Seraphim so great was because he simply wanted to pass on what was the Orthodox teaching, not to add or subtract from it. And
I agree.
Okay. Basil says the patriarchal text of 1907 seems rather solid. Yeah, that's the new. I think that's the Old and New Testament issued by the Ecumenical Patriarch in 1907. Yeah, it is. I think.
I like the Douay Reams. I'm just going to stick with that.
Well, and though again, the Douay Reams, as we read it today, is a revision by Dr. Challoner.
Yeah.
In the 1740s.
And there was that one guy who did the non-Challoner version on CD.
Yeah, I saw that it's something like $100 to buy the whole thing or something like that. I actually have a PDF version of something like 20 of the books of the old early 1600s Douay Reams on my computer somewhere in the recovered file section when I switched over to Linux. And one of the interesting things is I think this is something Challoner did. When Challoner did his revision of the Douay Reams in the 1740s, he did in fact do a little bit of updating of the language, especially in the New Testament. And this is why the nominative plural pronoun ye is found very, very sparsely in the Challoner revision. You will find it occasionally, but he prefers to simply use what was originally the accusative, singular you. I mean, a plural you, the accusative plural you, objective plural. They would say you in place of ye. See that if you read the King James New Testament and the Douay Reams New Testament, a lot of the differences come down to Challoner's revision, where he kind of de-emphasized ye and used you in place of things and such. So and sometimes I think Challoner prefers to use dust a lot instead of doest and things like that. So there are a few of those other areas, but I still think it's a very good text. You're right, I agree with it. And of course the Psalter in the Douay Reams is in fact is basically the Old Latin Psalter, which is basically the Septuagint Psalter. So that's why I think we've had this discussion before that the HTM Psalter is in many ways nearly identical to the Douay Reams Psalter, except for stylistic differences in a few places.
Alois Schlickgruber, it's funny that he said I asked him a different post if you have a podcast available. I'm going to put that link again. I don't know if this will work, but maybe we can find out live if it does. I found something called PodSync, which apparently allows you to turn YouTube channels into podcasts. So if this, let us know, Alois, if this link works. So let me see if. Okay, I didn't see which site did you post. Just let me know, and I'll see if I can help work with that one. And we'll get to the next question while we're doing that. Father, you want to take that?
A lot of Orthodox talk about Western dialectics. What is meant by this criticism, and why is essence, energy, or east-west not dialectical? What would you say, Father?
Well, first off, dialectics is a broad term, and so I'm not against the term dialectics, and I'm not against the use of dialectics. Technically, all apologetics can fall into dialectics. What I'm avoiding and what I want to avoid is dialogue for the sake of dialogue. If there must be an absolute point where we have to say, well, this is the Orthodox teaching and this is not. I think when we reduce things to just raw dialectics, everything becomes a question. And I think that that's not an Orthodox position at all. Because we are a church of revelation. The church, has what is revealed to it, first through the incarnation and through life, etc., through the life of Christ and through the life of the church. So I think that there are some things that are not open to question. And
now, the dictionary definition of dialectics is a systematic method of argument that attempts to resolve the contradictions in opposing views or ideas. I think this is part of the idea that you have two opposing views. you argue, and then you produce like a synthesis at the very end.
Right.
Supposedly, but that's not how the church operates. The church is we're not arguing with the Monophysites or the Muslims or the pagans to try to find out,
like, hey, maybe
how can we
right.
combine their views with us. We're like, well, this is the truth, and here's how we explain it.
Yeah, so I think that's part of the problem, and it's not Western dialectics. I'd like to make that clear because we're both Westerners. We use the Latin, right? We're all for Orthodox preaching the faith, whether of a Western or an Eastern sort. But the point is, dialectics go across the board. You can find just as many Russian philosophers who are using modernist sort of philosophy systems as you can Western ones, and that doesn't necessarily mean that it's better because it comes from a Russian. It just means that it's in a different language. The point is, the church's language is one of preaching the truth and one of resolving objections to the truth, but it is not one of trying to synthesize truth and falsehood. I don't come into a discussion with a Monophysite thinking, well, hopefully let's see if he can prove that he's right and maybe I'll agree with him. I know he's wrong. I know he's wrong because of what the church teaches. It's the same thing if I go into a discussion with a Roman Catholic. If a Roman Catholic is very well educated, so on and so forth, and wants to make an argument, then like I did when I started this, thank God, from many years ago, I make the sign of the cross and I go on because I have faith that it will work out. One thing that we have to understand is, and I point this out, Rule 0 of Orthodox Apologetics, as I put on the Facebook page, is to have faith. If you are operating under the assumption that your faith is wrong, that the Orthodox faith could be wrong, then you've already lost faith. There's no point in having the argument. You must have that certainty, and if you do, you will find that the fathers will give answer to everything you need in your argument. You have no need to rely upon your own virtues of argument.
Okay, so the follow-up question, or part of that question, was, is essence energy? Why is essence energy not dialectical? I don't know if you could maybe elaborate on that. What do they mean? Why is it meant by this criticism, and why is essence energy not dialectical? Do you understand what he's speaking about there, Father?
Well, I mean, I don't think that essence energy is dialectical because that implies that it's reduced to that essence and energy are reduced to concepts and not realities. The essence of God, that which is unapproachable, which I've said on previous podcasts, is real. The energies of God, which I've pointed out is how God approaches his creation, is real. These are not dialectical questions. These are the teaching of the church. In that sense, it's not, it's not a negotiable point. We believe in essence and energies. If you want to call them essence and operations, you can. It's irrelevant. The point is, God does dwell in inapproachable light. God does react to his creation and does interact with his creation, as we teach in all the prayers and services of the church. So I would say it's not dialectical at all. If you want to elaborate a bit more, Tonic, I have no problem with that, and I'd be glad to address it. But I can't see how one would say essence and energy is somewhat less than .
I think the idea may be something like, we know one side says you cannot approach the essence of God; it's impossible to approach it. The other side says no, but God can be reached. Therefore, the synthesis of those arguments is to say there's something of God that cannot be reached, and there's something of God that can be reached. I guess that's maybe what he's trying to say, that's like a dialectical tension.
But it's not a dialectical teaching. The point is, that's the teaching in the scriptures. We know that there's some part of God that can't be reached, and we know that God does reach us through the incarnation and so on and so forth. And yeah, I would agree with that, Basil, that essence energy is antonym, not dialectical.
Yes.
But
okay, but just to move on, Basil says, what is mortal sin in Orthodoxy? Does it differ from the Papist understanding? And I put a link to what St. Nicodemus of the Holy Mountain says. St. Nicodemus of the Holy Mountain says in his book called the Exomologiterion, or Manual of Confession, which you used to be able to buy, but now it's like a $200 book. I think Uncut Mountain Press used to print it, but I think it's gone out of print for some reason. But if you look on the book, St. Nicodemus talks about mortal sins, pardonable sins, sins of omission, deadly sins, etc. He says, according to Gunarius Scholarius, George Carisios, the Orthodox Confession, which is the official catechism, Chrysanthenos of Jerusalem, mortal sins are those voluntary sins which either corrupt the love for God alone or the love for neighbor and for God, and which render again the one committing them an enemy of God and liable to the eternal death of hell. Generally speaking, they are pride, love, pride, love of money, sexual immorality, envy, gluttony, anger, and despondency or indifference. And then you have what are called pardonable sins. Pardonable sins are those voluntary sins which do not corrupt the love of God or the love for neighbor, nor do they render the person an enemy of God and liable to eternal death, to which the transgression even the saints are susceptible, according to the words of the brother of God. For in many things we all sin. And John says, if we say that we have no sin, we deceive ourselves. And according to canons 125, 126, and 127 of Carthage. These sins, according to Coresios and Crescenthos, are idle talk, the initial inclination and agitation of anger, the initial inclination of lust, the initial inclination of hate, a white lie, passing envy, or that which is commonly called jealousy, which is slight grief over the good fortunes of one's neighbor and the like. Know also, spiritual fathers, that the many sins which are generally called pardonable are not of one and the same degree, but they are of varying degrees, smaller and larger, lower and higher, and that pardonable sins and mortal sins are two extremes. For in between these extremes there are found varying degrees of sins, beginning from the pardonable ones and proceeding up to the mortal ones, which degrees were not given by the ancients, perhaps because they are many and varied according to the class and specific kinds of sins, but could have named them if they so desired. Here we name some of them for the benefit of the clarity in your knowledge. And then there are sins of omission. I put the link on there, so there is an understanding. I think the main difference, and Father Joseph, you could comment here too, that when St. Nicodemus says a deadly sin and a pardonable sin, a deadly sin would be one that when you commit it, if you die in that state, you would not go. That you're not going to have salvation. All right. The pardonable and a pardonable sin would be those sins that when you die, they can be pardoned by services done. That's when people die. We pray for the dead for those reasons. The remission of their sins and such. But there is no concept of this whole treasury of merits of the saints, the temporal debt. I think you know more about that than I do. I never could quite understand the whole Roman Catholic system of that if you do your penance, that's technically not meaning you're relieved of temporal guilt, right, Father? There's some other weird system. I never quite understood it.
What it is basically the idea that if you're in mortal sin, even these indulgences, etc., will not help you. The assumption is that if you are in some sort of sin that is pardonable, there must still be a punishment, and the indulgences can therefore remove that punishment from you in purgatory.
Yes. Now, if you read the whole section, the whole link, it goes a lot of detail. Saint Nicodemus quotes Saint Theophylact of Bulgaria and several other saints, and he talks about this distinction between there are some sins which appear to be between pardonable and mortal sins or deadly sins, and that a lot of that's up to the spiritual father to determine what kind of sin you committed and such. Though, the standard answer is that you should just confess all your sins just to make sure, instead of going into a in-depth, psychoanalysis of things, just confess all your sins when you go to confession, or all the sins you can remember, at least the big ones.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay. Well, let me see. What's next? It says, as Jay Dyer always says, Orthodox don't do dialectics. I'll just say I'm glad he's become a fan of our show. Let's continue to the next question. Essence said that's not we covered that. Uncut mountain press plants to reprint it, by the way.
Okay, that's the Orthodox. That's St. Basil's. That's St. Nicodemus's book.
Okay, good. And then on a related note to my last question, is God as pure act or self-subsistent being at all a patristic idea? Well, the second one, yes, self-subsistent being, he is being and he is self-subsistent. I don't deny that. I have an issue with purus actus, which is what it seems you're referring to. And that's Aquinas basically referring to God as literally, the pure act, as the absolute perfection of God. I don't think that you find that in the fathers. They tend not to see God so poorly. I don't mean to put it that way, but God is, he's Father, Son, and Holy Ghost. He's active. He's alive in our lives. I tend not to see him as just this thing. And it goes to, Thomas's famous first mover argument. Like he's some sort of rock. I don't tend to see God that way. The Godhead is bigger than that. It's greater than that. And it's, if you want to take the apophatic side, it's inexplicably greater than that. But the point is, I think when we start referring to God as the pure act, I mean, just even the words themselves make him sound small.
Yes. And technically, when we talk about God doing things and moving and operating, that's in reference to his operations or his energies. We can't talk about God. You can't refer to God's essence as a pure act because his essence is incomprehensible by anyone. And even when St. Gregory Palamas talks about God's essence as genuinely simple, what he's saying is really, even though it sounds like he's making a positive statement, he's making, if you read his full context, he's making a negative statement that it's so simple, it's so genuinely this, that is beyond even what we can think of as genuinely simple. So, even when we say positive things about God's essence, that we're really not saying positive. We're really kind of, if we say is God's essence uncreated? Yes. But are we defining his essence by simply saying uncreated? Well, no. We're just giving, you know what I mean? So, I'm not sure if I'm...
No, it makes sense. I mean, the problem is that no matter how, if you simplify God to the point where he sounds humanly simple, you've done it wrong.
He's not the spaghetti monster, the meatball spaghetti monster, which the atheists always bring up. Right. I don't know if have you heard that analogy, that argument before?
Yeah, it's really a goofy one.
And supposedly people believe in the flying spaghetti monster that lives between
their argument is it's basically an argument to the first mover thing, which is, why do I have to believe a God did it as opposed to a flying spaghetti monster? It's dumb. I mean, why would it's first off, it's flying, it's spaghetti, and it's a monster. These are all human constructs, so it's already stupid. But in any case, people want to say dumb things. If people choose to believe in a flying spaghetti monster, they're still in a better position than somebody who's a full-on atheist.
Yeah, because they at least have an idea that there's something out there.
Yeah,
that's supernatural, and I'm
endorsing the spaghetti monster. If that's all you can believe in, start there, and the rest will come out.
All right, see you later, Basil.
Take care. All right, so we're here with questions here for another half hour. If anyone has any questions, feel free to put them in the chat. We're going to...
Are there any apologetic subjects you think need to be addressed, Father, that we haven't addressed before? Or any top look?
Wow. Let me think. We generally addressed apologetics as regards to papacy. We've talked about, Protestantism. We've talked about the Jews. We occasionally talk...
What about Islam? Someone asked you weren't able to be here in the last show or you had to leave and to go to work and things, but people were asking what here's one of the questions I'd like to see your answer from. Okay. If a Muslim comes to you and they say, why should we believe Christianity over Islam? What would you say to them?
I would probably say something that gets me punched in the face.
Okay, go ahead.
Well, if I was to say something, I would say, well, in the first place, I would, paraphrase St. Maximus, I'd say, if you'd like, we can speak peacefully about this, but you must agree to speak peacefully, otherwise it's not worth a discussion at all. That would be my first suggestion in speaking to somebody, and if they agree to that, then I would say, well, in the first place, we have to consider something. If you look in the Quran, for example, it talks about the preservation of the truth in terms of a true gospel, which was corrupted over time. If you look in the Quran, it talks about the corruption of the scriptures by those who did it for money. It is important to understand, first off, that if you're talking about the corruption of the scriptures in the first centuries of Christianity, you would be saying effectively that the early Christians were willing to get martyred, beheaded, crucified, persecuted, tortured, treated awfully, but that they were totally cool with changing the word of God and the writings of the holy apostles for cold, hard cash. It's a stupid argument. It's a very weak argument, and it's one that's used I wouldn't say stupid to the person, but I'd say it's a very weak argument to begin with. And I would say that it's impossible if Christians believe that they must die for the truth, that they must die for the faith, and that we are willing to move on for that we would then pervert, the holy words of God for money. It doesn't make any sense.
Well, some of the Muslim apologists in the early medieval period actually tried to say it was the Apostle Paul which corrupted everything. But then that still doesn't explain why would the Apostle St. Paul be willing to endure being stoned several times, or rejected by his own people, the Jews, tormented wherever he went, persecuted, and finally beheaded.
Yeah, and I think that the greatest witness to Christianity is the fact that we were willing, and we are willing to, die without killing others, but we are willing to die for the sake of the true faith. And I think that, unfortunately, I would say that the texts of the Quran downplay that to a large degree. They kind of imply that that wasn't that martyric suffering and truth, desire.
They don't even acknowledge it. It's a non-entity in the Quran.
Well, yeah, no, it's not even a non-entity. They flat out say that the Christians corrupted the gospel for money. If that's the case, then no, they weren't even martyric. They were just looking for, they were, what's the word I'm looking for? Cash hungry. They were
mercenary.
Yeah, and that makes no sense. That wouldn't, brought the church to where it was. That wouldn't have brought the church to the fruition where it is. That's where I would begin, and most likely, of course, you'll hear the same tired questions that you hear from Protestants, from Unitarians, God being one, because in the Quran it says there's one God, not three, not four. But we don't believe that, A, that the Theotokos is part of the Godhead, or B, that there are three gods. We believe in three persons in one God, and I think that can be easily demonstrated. Why would God humble himself to be born of a virgin? Well, it answers its own question. The point is, most of the the Islamic arguments against Christianity, outside of moral arguments, which is something we're going to talk to about there, Alois, don't so hang on, they don't hold up very well. And I would advise anyone who is, if they're looking at Islam, and they look at their arguments against Christianity, but then look at what the fathers say about those same arguments, and you'll realize that they're talking two different languages, much in the same way as when a Mormon or a Jehovah's Witness starts addressing Orthodoxy. You don't have any idea what you're talking about, and if you don't, then you realize you're arguing with a person who's arguing with a straw man. It's not real.
And also remember the question about why would God humble himself to be born of a virgin, and the reason is because God loved man and would become a man in order to save man. Right. But in Islam, the concept is that they supposedly say, well, God is so exalted, how could he ever do this? And in fact, there's a famous cantiga 163, I think, from the medieval Spanish. There's a medieval Spanish collections of these like folk poetry and folk songs. And in this cantiga, it's actually very beautiful, from the 10th century. What it talks about is there was a Moorish nobleman who had captured an icon. It actually says icona. If you read the translation, it says statue, but in fact, you look at the manuscript, it's an icon. He's clearly captured an icon. And it was an icon of Our Lady holding Christ, okay? The standard icon of Our Lady and a Christ, all right? And it was beautifully written, had gold leaf, everything. And he didn't destroy it. He put it on his mantle, and he was obsessed with it for some reason. And he kept on saying to himself, how can the Christians believe that God came to earth, was born of a woman, and became a little baby? How can the exalted, mighty, omnipotent, one beyond all reason, deign so to do this for mortal man? I cannot believe this. I cannot. I couldn't. If God would show me some miracle, I would believe it. I really do want to believe it. And the icon began to weep. All right, and he immediately came to the conclusion, that God had become a man. He actually repented, and he had a priest come, and he was baptized, and he and his whole house. And that, in fact, happened in 10th century in Spain, I believe. And but the point is that the cantiga wasn't just making up a fictional Muslim dialoguer, all right, or interlocutor, okay. This is actually the Islamic view that they thought it was ridiculous that God would care for man because as anything more than a human cares for an ant colony. Because in Islam, God views man as men like slaves, or like, let's say, a pet, or let's say a colony of ants. You can be nice to a colony of ants and give them food and things, but you're not going to die for the colony of ants. You don't really care for them that much, all right? And I think that's part of the thing. It is a part of the problem in Islam is their concept of God is almost like that of an exalted supreme slave master who just deigns to, do anything for you. He would never die for you. He would never really endure anything, become a man or anything for you. But those medieval traditions that relate Muslims, their objections before they become Christians, are very relevant. Yeah. And also the point was that the icon began to weep. It showed that physical matter could be sanctified And that was another part in Islam, I guess, that was part of his polemic. This one Muslim nobleman, that how could God become a baby? How could and by a physical manifestation of a sanctified matter, it had a lot of subtext in how Muslims and Christians interacted and their presuppositions about things. That a weeping icon would force him to convert immediately. All right. Now, of course, that doesn't always happen, and I'm assuming that this man probably already had a disposition somewhere. You know how it says in the scriptures that God desires men everywhere to be saved, and that I think it says in the book of Acts, I can't remember, where it talks about how there are men of goodwill in all nations, and if they look to reach out towards God, God will reach out towards them. And it brings up the case of Cornelius the centurion and such, So, but that's one point, And in fact, if you look at some of these Qurans that are printed that have Islamic apologetics in it, Islamic apologetics is extremely weak. And like you say, it mentions things about, they corrupted the early New Testament. It brings up stuff about what Christ said, no one is good, but God. Then why do you call me good? As if supposedly that's an argument for Christ not being God. But I think Islam has never really had to develop any type of apologetic, because its apologetic is it conquers you and you do what it says or they kill you. That's the Islamic apologetic.
Well, ultimately, what happened with Saint Gregory Palamas is when he was testifying before the Sultan, they asked him to speak, and he spoke and he answered their arguments eloquently. At which point, one of the guards slapped him. But the Sultan, being so impressed by his arguments, actually had the guard put in jail. But the point is, what it comes down to is, if you want to argue, with Islam, you're going to end up dealing with a system that presupposes that it's okay to attack your interlocutor if you don't have a good answer.
Whereas in Orthodoxy, even when you had situations that the Orthodox Church was the official religion and there was some level of suppression of non-Orthodox, that's not necessarily a part of the Orthodox faith.
That's not our go-to.
Exactly. That may the rulers and some bishops may say that's good because of societal stability, but we're not saying that's the only way we can defend ourselves, because most of the time we can't defend ourselves like that. And that's not how the early church even was able to defend itself until basically the 4th century. And then it was more or less defending ourselves against pagans who had persecuted us for 300 years. That's the other subtext. One of the reasons the pagan temples were destroyed was that they were, in fact, centers of 1, prostitution, 2, other forms of gross immorality. For example, I think, who was the saint? Saint Procopius, the one missionary that went to Gaza in the 4th century, in the early 5th century. In his name, I forget his name, but he had to destroy one of the temples of Baal because they were finding dead children there, where they were sacrificing people to, and such. So the attempt to conflate Christianity's state as a state religion with Islam is one. We didn't spread by forming militant bands and then attacking the Roman emperors and then invading all the other countries. That was not how Christianity primarily spread.
No.
Even when they bring up the issue of the Emperor Charlemagne having the what's called the bloody verdict of Verdun, in which there were 5,000 Saxon nobles and chieftains that were executed, the reason that was done was that it was the end of like a 25, 30-year-long war where the Saxons had invaded Germany and were killing the Christian population. And Charlemagne had made numerous treaties with them. They continually went back on them. And like the 7th time this happened, he basically said, give me all the leaders of the rebellion, and I'm going to have a blood court to determine their guilt. And if they're guilty, they're going to be beheaded. Unless they agree to become Christian. Well, though, actually, some manuscripts say there was no offer to become Christian because technically they had already all been baptized. So they were basically being punished for, killing tens of thousands of people. That's not the same as, Caliph so-and-so invading Asia Minor and forcing the population to become Muslim.
Yeah.
So I think,
I think that
maybe we should do a whole show answering common objections of the Muslims against Christianity. We should think about that, Father.
Okay. About that. Let's go to the next question.
Okay, what's a good apologetic argument when an atheist uses the group morality issue? Like when they say we don't need Christian morals, since as a group, people will use the non-aggression principle, I guess. How do we answer that?
Oh, boy. This is a two-level question, Alois. I'm going to be honest with you. The reason I say it's on two levels is because what it's saying is, why do we need Christian ethics or Christian morals when we can just use modern morals? And I'll touch on the Non-Aggression Pact in a moment, because modern law does not require Christianity. The first point is the historical one, which is that historically, all of the laws that we have in place in Western society have, in some way, shape, or form, if they're good laws, they usually have their origins in Christianity. I'm saying bad laws like the transgender stuff. That's all modern stuff, but it's relevant, and I'll get to it in a moment. But more importantly, from a historical standpoint, it's impossible to say that secular law on its own is sufficient, and history itself is a proof of that. Wherever history you find that law societies were created that were not Christian, often there were gross deviations of what we would consider normal law. As to the second point, which is whether the non-aggression principle or non-aggression pact is sufficient, it becomes a question of when you define aggression and how do you define aggression. For example, if you're talking about aggression towards your house, fine, you can put up a fence for your house. But in many societies that are non-Christian, incest is allowed. Child murder is allowed. At which point what you're saying is effectively it would be aggression if you interfered. Now one could say, well, that would be interfering on the child's freedom. Well, when does the child have freedom? The problem is that you ultimately continue finding that if you allow the non-aggression principle, all it is doing is evading the inevitable collapse of society. Always. It sounds great from an anarchistic perspective, and I'll tell you, there's loads of happy anarchists and ordered societies ready to overthrow it. But once they actually do take over, all the things fall apart, because you can't base things on a simple non-aggression principle, because then the question of what you can aggress is a very real one. You don't know what's non-aggression at that point. You try to define it by the society, but society can change its opinions, as we're learning now. So the point is, will society that?
Sorry, but for example, I'm just wondering what do they define? Don't NAP people usually say things like, as long as you don't affect my person and my property? But how do you define what's your property? If you claim land, but then somebody holds a Georgist or geo-libertarian position that land, technically no one can really own land, then they'll claim by you owning land, you're aggressing against them. So it doesn't already presume the concept that everybody holds some sort of libertarian property rights view or something like that?
Well, it assumes that there's a collective morality, and the point is there's no guarantee of that, especially if you decide to openly reject Christian morals. And historically, societies that do that will continually be under periods of revolution. Society in general does always fall under revolution, but there are at least social norms when the faith holds it together. So I would say that if a person is trying to use the group morality issue, then ultimately it falls apart because the group defines the morals, and ultimately that will lead to automatic disagreement. Father, you wanted to add anything to that?
Schicklgruber adds the point, I didn't think of interfering with another person's morals would be aggression.
Well, okay. Yeah, and that's the biggest problem with it, is that ultimately all of these arguments where we say we don't need Christian morals always presuppose that we're in a society that's ultimately been shaped by them. And it's very rare that you find otherwise, and when you do find otherwise, it's usually chaotic or horrible or someplace you don't want to live. So
I mean, I don't think any society has really been founded upon just a simple, don't do anything bad to me and I won't do anything bad to you. That's all that really is.
That never happens.
Because how do you define that? For example, yes, there's true the golden rules of what don't do unto others, do unto others as you would have them do unto you. All right, and that but that presupposes you have a certain moral compass to begin with.
And also presupposes you're following the golden rule.
Exactly. Now, if you believe it's all right for someone to kill you, then are you going to go around killing other people? Or maybe you think you have a superior morality because you're the Superman, and that everybody is trash compared to you because you're more intelligent. The kind of the sociopathic idea.
Yeah.
By
the way, Nietzschean philosophies were common in the 20th centuries with to some degree Nazism, fascism, and even to some degree communism, even though supposedly everyone was equal. Those arguments would come forth whenever we were talking about.
But it was the role of those who had power over those who did not. That was ultimately what determined all morals.
Exactly.
You know.
So. Okay. Now, there's Atomic Lead asked a question.
Okay, go ahead, read it.
Yeah. Do the priestess and fathers discuss the seed of the woman in Genesis 3:15? Is it he or she will bruise the serpent's head, i.e., Christ or Mary? The overwhelming majority of Greek texts would argue that it's he. The Latin Vulgate does use the feminine on that, which, I mean, really, I think it's considering that our love for the Theotokos and her role in the incarnation, I don't think it's that much of a point. I think that a lot of times you usually find this argument very commonly in Roman Catholic apologetics, arguing for things like the Immaculate Conception, because they're trying to push past what is necessary for the Theotokos' role in history. But I think either one works. I mean, it's ultimately the Greek text does say he. But if you want to believe that Theotokos smashed Satan on the head, I mean, I don't really have a problem with that. I don't think
because technically she would have done this because of Christ.
Right.
She was like, we can talk about Our Lady as being the gate through which God came onto earth.
Right.
And in the Akathists and canons, it's all talking about. So it's ultimately still Christ that did this.
Yeah. And that's I think that's I don't worry too much about it. I think that it depends on whether you're following the Greek or the Latin on it, but either way, I think the prophecy holds sway, and I think that ultimately Christ has dominion over the devil. So,
all right, Father. Any what else do we have?
Oh, let's see. Aloysia is commenting. It's like the Overton window. Morals change over time when the group decides what is or is not moral. Yeah, I think that is really what sums it up. I mean, the Overton window has really become part of the popular discourse in the past 5 or 6 years. But the idea that morals change over time and the group deciding what is or is not moral is something we can see in the history of secular society over the 20th century and the 21st century. And I think that by and large, more and more people, especially in younger generations, are rejecting this because it makes no sense. So I hope that is, I hope to see that more people start realizing that there is an absolute truth and that it's not a personal truth. The use of my truth, as I've heard many times in common discourse in public language, is evil. There's no such thing as my truth. There's only such thing as truth. And, my view on the truth is possible, but not, my truth. You can't have a personal truth. Truth is truth. And so I think that that's something that's lost upon a lot of society today. And I think that that's our job as a church. It's the same thing. My church. No, there's the church. There is the teaching of Christ, and there is not. That's it. Don't know if that, that's my opinion.
All right. I think we have about 12 minutes left. Maybe we've exhausted most of everybody's questioning abilities at this moment.
Well, it's. I think.
Well, there's a question. There's a question though. Somebody asked in the apologetics forum, and they say, "Why was Pontius Pilate's name put in?" Okay, so for example, why was Pontius Pilate put into the Nicene Creed? Well, how would we answer that, Father?
I think that. Well, again, we could go through, the work of the Council of Nicaea, but I think it's for a very simple purpose, and that it
because the Apostles' Creed before that and other early creeds mention Pontius Pilate.
Yeah, and I think it's very simply, it establishes the date and time it occurred. If we get right down to it, by knowing that he was crucified under Pontius Pilate, you know exactly in what period Christ died, and Christ
because Christianity is not just an abstract faith; it has a historical basis. We're not just talking. For example, this concept that it doesn't really matter whether the New Testament or the Old Testament are historically accurate or they're a bunch of legends. That's nonsense. We don't have some abstract Platonic concept that has no bearing whatsoever on history. So obviously,
in any universe, Pontius Pilate will still be the person in charge when Christ died. dies and resurrects. That's all it comes down to.
Yep. Okay, let me see what else we have here.
I haven't got any questions in the email.
Yeah.
No.
The old question someone had asked was, what did Christ mean when he said, neither the angels nor the Son of Man know the time nor the hour?
Well, I think
the general patristic answer is that Christ actually did know, but that when he says the Son of Man doesn't know, he's saying that as a form of speech, that he knows not for their sakes. That's actually the general patristic answer.
I don't want to be too much. I don't want to point to too much nuance, but I would say that would be the answer he's giving because he's incarnate, as opposed to. I don't want to imply that he's lying. The point I'm trying to make is that he allows himself to not know as the.
Well, you gotta be very careful with this question, Father, because there's actually something in the Synodicon of Orthodoxy that anathematizes positions on this.
Yeah,
and I have to look it up.
Okay,
I'm just saying because this has been a very complicated question because St. John Chrysostom does state that Christ did know at that point the day or the hour, but that when he says he knew not, he says he knows not for their sakes. That this was a common wit teaching method, but it wasn't implying he was lying to anybody.
Well, and that's an important point because that's the argument that many people will make was Christ lying, and the point is
he wasn't lying.
I would say he was taking advantage of his human nature. But in any case, that doesn't imply that the Logos knows anything that the Arche doesn't. It's an earthly question meant for earthlings.
If Pontius Pilate had Jesus killed because of the Jews, was not Pontius Pilate destined to do so? Well, no one is destined to do so in that sense. He had free will. He could have said, "I'm simply not going to do this."
Well, now Pontius Pilate, I tend to I forget.
No, if you look at the Gospels, Pilate obviously had some sort of. Remember, his wife Saint Claudia said, "Have thou nothing to do with that just man." Pontius Pilate actually asked the Jews several times. In the Gospel of John, I think, says he tried at many ways to try to set Christ free because there's a simple reason. He did not remember. Pilate did not want to be involved in ordering the execution of somebody that might cause a riot and a rebellion, because there had actually been 2 occasions before which Pilate had used heavy-handed tactics like a year or 2 years before that actually precipitated a rebellion, and he got blamed a lot by the Roman authorities, and he could have been basically fired or even imprisoned or even worse, executed, put to death by the emperor because the last thing the Roman emperor wanted was to send an army out there, which cost a lot of money.
Yeah.
Right? So ultimately, did he have to do it? He didn't have to do it, but I'm just saying to say destined like he had no choice in the matter. He had no free will. I don't.
Well, he had a choice in the matter. The problem is it wasn't from his perspective a very good choice.
Yes, he washed his hands. He said, "I'm done with this. You take over and everything." But he still ultimately bore some responsibility. We're not saying that
he could have in theory just left, but he did not.
Yes, he kind of represents the kind of the worldly figure who may, in some sense, have a little bit of sympathy, but they're really not going to. It's like kind of talking to the town manager, or who's like, "I kind of agree with you, but I'm still going to sacrifice you because it's rather you than me, even though I know you're right."
Yeah.
I don't know if you've ever encountered those people in business or government who,
all the time.
That's kind of how I think of Pontius Pilate. And in later tradition, Saint Claudia, of course, is and not in later tradition, Saint Claudia is considered a saint. His wife is considered a saint in the church, and there are some early traditions. I don't know if I don't say they're true or not. That do say Pilate. One says Pilate committed suicide. Another 3rd, 4th century tradition says he actually repented and accepted baptism on his deathbed. We don't really know.
Yeah.
So we can always hope that happens.
Well, that would probably be the Gospel of Nicodemus or the Acts of Pilate. Yes. Basically, Eusebius had no idea about that, so my guess is that it was probably later than that. It's a nice, hopeful thought that maybe Pilate repented, but the reality is, we don't know.
Yes. Now, another interesting phenomena I've witnessed, Father, is Roman Catholics always, as soon as Pope Francis starts to become more active in the news about saying one of the crazy heretical things he always says, that they always seem to appear on Orthodox forums to basically be pressing ultramontane claims even more even more aggressively than at any other time. It's almost as like I compare this to whistling past the graveyard.
I tend to
tell me what you think.
I see a deeper psychological reason to it, which is why I'm very lenient towards Roman Catholics during this time. And what I mean by that is, having been a Roman Catholic, and before God brought me to Orthodoxy, I was working in Roman Catholic Apologetics many years ago. There's a psychological pull. There's a psychological comfort that comes from being a Roman Catholic, knowing you're right because the Pope is right and everything's safe. And I don't tend to think that the reason they become ultramontane is because they have any designs against us. I think it's because they're so bothered that unless they prove that we're wrong, they'll know that they're wrong. And I think that psychologically, having to try to beat us up makes them feel better because they know that everything, the core of what they believe, that the Pope is the center of orthodoxy and the truth in the world, is falling apart. And
well, that's my point. That's what I'm trying to make.
Yeah,
I agree with you.
Yeah, I think
that's what I'm saying.
I think that to me, it's a sign of desperation, and that's okay. I mean, I can understand that the patient needs assistance and they're going through something, and you just have to kind of be patient with them. The best you can do is answer them, point out where they're wrong, so that they understand that even their own set of beliefs, which are so largely emotional and not doctrinal, ultimately, they need revision if they want.
How are they emotional? What do you explain that? What do you mean they're emotional more than doctrinal?
It's such a comfort when I was growing up as a Roman Catholic to know that Christ spoke to St. Peter, and St. Peter became the Pope, and the Pope is still around today. And it's almost like, I hate to say, almost like a Mormon prophet, but the idea that that the church would never fall because we have the Pope, and the simple reality is that the Pope was never meant to hold everything together like that. That's not the reality. So that's what I mean by it's a comfort. It's a psychological comfort to know that Christianity has its most simple solution in the Pope.
Yes. So they want to pretend like it, but they're still in some sense pretending like Pius IX is the Pope as opposed to Bergoglio.
They may not even know who Pius IX is. I didn't when I was growing up, but you did learn that the Pope was, Peter, and he was protecting the church.
So Francis could even hypothetically start ordaining women.
I think but I think that at the point he is now, which is why we have so much Roman Catholic interest in Orthodox apologetics, I think even at the point he is now, it's causing people to leave at their own level. And I think that, the women priest thing, I think that that's a much lower level in terms of threshold. I think that the people who are coming now are probably, some of the smarter Roman Catholics who know that what he's doing is wrong anyway, regardless of whether he ordains women. I think that if he starts ordaining women, which I think is unrealistic, but if he did, that level would shrink way down. And Atomic Lead asked, do you think the RCC is collapsing then? Yeah, I would say that that's not even a question. Not to be offensive, but I mean, you look at the news stories, look at how much they're selling off. In terms of just because of all the things that are, all the lawsuits, etc., all the sodomy and so on and so forth. That is one aspect of it. But then on top of that, the one thing that was supposed to make them feel secure, which is the Pope, he's just spouting off heresy every week. And the point is, that's causing people to say, what do we do now? Where are we going now? And it's a huge opportunity because right now, mostly a lot of them are going to just run to the groups like the SSPX, etc., people that look formally Roman Catholic, but in reality have adopted already a position that is not even traditionally Roman Catholic to begin with. So I think that, I think the RCC is collapsing. And I should say that as a church, as a socio-political force, I would say that it still exists. It still has a lot of money. It still has a lot of sway over governments. It's still a socio-political force. I don't want to imply that the RCC is going to disappear tomorrow, but as a church, as a collective body, it's falling apart, and it's falling apart in the worst way, because a lot of the people who don't have the theological education are just going to say, you know what, maybe I'll just skip church and watch football this Sunday, and they're going to miss out on the true faith, because they're going to think, well, if it's not real here, it's probably not real anywhere, and our job is to say, no, you're wrong. and hope that somebody listens.
All right, Father, we got like 40 seconds left. Anything you want to say?
No. I'd like to thank everyone who was listening this time. Again, we'll be back on Thursday for Orthodoxy versus Everyone, God willing, and we'll keep going from there. As Alois, if you want to, okay, you said you put the link into player from the FM podcast as it couldn't pull up the feed. I clicked the link and it's just HTML script. I will keep trying. Hopefully, we'll have something set up for podcasts by next time.
All right. Well,
thank you to everyone.
Today is the Feast of All Saints, so everybody have a happy All Saints feast.
Okay, Felix Festum.
Benedicite.
Good night, all.
Good night.